Hello and welcome to NTV Wild Talk with me, Smriti Vidyarthi. Today we're coming to you from the safari walk at the KWS headquarters here in Nairobi. Now, our topic of conversation is critical. It is about CITES, that is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. More on that in just a moment, but first, meet my panel of guests. Solomon Chalo is head of CITES implementation from KWS. As the lead technical expert, he was responsible for coordinating the technical preparations and submissions to the CITES Secretariat, ensuring the country had adequate technical capacity to address each agenda item. Beatrice Kayota is a principal research scientist at the National Museums of Kenya. Beatrice was responsible for plant issues at the Conference of the Parties. She was the chair of the CITES African Trees Working Group. Patrick Omondi is the Deputy Director of Species Conservation and Management at KWS. He chaired a group of 30 government delegations that led the elephant discussions on African elephant proposals and documents. Patrick was the lead advisor in all species listing proposals by the Kenya delegation. Rhoda Ogoma is a Senior Assistant Director at the Office of Public Prosecutions. She was the only prosecutor in the delegation responsible for formulating and presenting proposals, giving the status of Kenya's progress in ensuring wildlife protection through law enforcement and prosecution. So this year's CITES conference has already passed. It took place in South Africa. Now that COP17 is over, the work in fact has just begun. There is so much to learn about that conference, what happened and how it impacts our wildlife and our plants right here in Kenya and across the world. Now, all my guests here today in fact attended the COP17 in South Africa. Welcome to NTV Wild Talk and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Solomon, I'll start with you. Break down CITES to us and COP17. How does it all work? Who's involved? Where does it happen? Tell us.
In simple terms, CITES is an agreement. It's an international agreement signed by governments with the purpose of governments to cooperate and regulate international trade in endangered species of animals and plants. So CITES is an acronym which means Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It was first signed in 1973 and entered into force in 1975. Governments agreeing to this agreement. Kenya as a country signed the agreement in 1978 and therefore Kenya is a signatory to the convention. Currently, we have 183 countries that are signatory to the convention. And
it's optional. You decide as a country whether or not you want to be part of CITES.
It is voluntary. You join voluntarily. Right. But when you join voluntarily, the provisions of the agreement are binding to that government. When all the governments meet, which these meetings takes place every 2 to 3 years, that meeting is called the Conference of the Parties.
That's COP.
That's COP.
Okay.
What we have, the meeting that has just happened in South Africa was the 17th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to CITES. And therefore we call it COP17.
Right, so Patrick, you have often attended the various COPs, the Conference of the Parties. They happen in different countries and different locations around the world. Once the countries meet, what happens there?
We discussed listing proposals, either to offer a species the highest level of protection or to list it to regulate trade so that it is sustainable and it does not impact on the survival of that species. So in this particular COP, we had the highest number of proposals to try and address the impact of trade in endangered species.
All right, well, you know, so many of our viewers may be thinking, oh, endangered species, that's probably elephants, but there are so many more. Beatrice, let me bring you in here because you focus on the plant species, and it's interesting to note that actually there are many endangered plant species. Tell us more about that.
You're absolutely right. Actually, the focus has been for Kenya, especially on elephants, but we do have a lot of plants which are at risk. And these are the categories of those plants. Either they are used as medicine, or they are used as wood, timber, herbal medicine, or in beauty products. And some of the examples I can give you is Prunus africana, which is used to treat prostate cancer, aloes, which are used a lot in beauty products, sandalwood, which is used as medicine, and many others.
So really plant species play a big role as well, and that is a key focus for CITES. Rhoda, why is CITES so critical, particularly for us here in Kenya, from a law enforcement point of view?
Well, I'd say that having ratified the treaty, that is CITES, there's a responsibility on us as a country to then ensure that we facilitate the protection that is sought under CITES. So that means that there's need to have regulations in place that would take care of the trade that is so often referred to as illegal, and there would be need for criminalization through penal provisions under our laws. And so law enforcement would of necessity require that there's efforts to facilitate the law enforcement apparatus through laws and such like provisions.
All right, we'll come back to more about where we stand with regard to our law and the Wildlife Act as well. But Solomon, you know, earlier I spoke to Beatrice about the plant species that are endangered, and there are, of course, so many animal species as well. Can you tell us which species across the world, and particularly here in Kenya, are in fact endangered?
Well, under CITES, the endangered species are classified into three, what we call Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3. We have over 5,000 animal species that are listed under CITES, and over 28,000 species listed under CITES for plants.
Really?
On the animals, the endangered species, we have the African elephant for the Kenya population in Appendix 1. We have the lions, the African lion, our population in Appendix 2. We have the pangolins that have been in Appendix 2, but one of the outcome of the COP is that they are now listed in Appendix 1. We have species of snakes, the vipers, two that are endemic to Kenya. They are now listed in Appendix 2. Wow. Initially they were not, but we did a proposal and has been adopted. They are now to be listed in Appendix 2. We have all species of chameleons.
Really?
Are now listed in Appendix 2.
Wow.
We even have crocodiles. They are listed in Appendix 2. There are other populations of other countries that are listed in 1. The listing depends on the levels of endangerment.
And how does one decide that this species needs to be put on Appendix 1, 2, or 3, and that this species is endangered, Patrick?
When we monitor level of illegal offtake for trade, then we collect data. If it is chameleons, if it is pangolins, we have arrests in our ports. So if we have a species that is highly sought, like the chameleons Solomon has mentioned, they are sought for pet trade in Europe, in the US, and some traffic them illegally. So if we have a collection and we want that trade regulated, then now we go to the conference of parties to list them on Appendix 2, so that when you do an arrest, you need to have a permit. You need to produce a permit.
Right.
The reason of listing, and you have to trade it. If it is an Appendix 2, you can trade, but you need a permit. But if it's so highly threatened, like the African elephant, our rhinos, for example, then we put them in Appendix 1. In Appendix 1, international trade is banned.
Right.
So in preparation for this, for conference of parties, it requires a lot of collaboration.
I can imagine, and I'll come to that in just a moment. Beatrice, How did you prepare for COP17? What was your role there, and what agenda did you go to South Africa with regard to the plant species?
Okay, first of all, this was a national agenda driven by the relevant ministries, with all the agencies that are involved, with the scientists as well as the policymakers. And first and foremost, we had preparatory meetings, consultative meetings that were held in several places in the country. And then we were all assigned groups of taxa, which is groups of animals or plants, as scientists. And we went through all the proposals, both ours and the others, all the 90 plus that were submitted. And then we come up with a national position based on the content of the proposals. And this is science-based. So that is how we prepared. So by the time we were leaving for South Africa, Kenya had a position on every proposal with a representative to present them from the country.
It seems like a lot of work went into this. Solomon, take us through some of the steps that it took to take these proposals to South Africa.
There's a set criteria on formulation of proposals that need to be considered at the conference of the parties. So one of the criteria, you have to look at the biological data, the science of that species. You look at the trade data, any trade data on that species you are proposing. And the third criteria is if you require a precautionary principle in listing of that species. So in the preparation of our proposals, which we came up with 14 proposals in total, we looked at all those issues for each species that we were proposing to present for listing, and we had a national agreement on these are the proposals we need to submit, and therefore these are the proposals we submitted to the conference of the parties for consideration, either for listing in Appendix 1, listing in Appendix 2, or transferring from one appendix to another depending on the levels of endangerment.
All right, so lots and lots of meetings. But Rhoda, why does Kenya take CITES and these COPs so seriously?
Since 1992, I think, we've had some sort of finger pointing to the country in regard to how we deal, or rather being a transit and a source country for these items of either ivory, rhino horn and the likes. So what happens is that there's been some level of listing that has got Kenya branded in the not so favorite gang of 8. Yes. And so for us, it is important that we fight to save the face of Kenya with regard to how we are viewed at the COP level. So basically what we have been doing is to work to show that we are serious and committed to the provisions of CITES and that our laws will seek to protect that.
But you know, Patrick, Kenya has participated in these COPs for many, many years now. Some might argue that really CITES and the conferences are just a place where talk happens and nobody really walks the talk. Have we really benefited from CITES and the COPs over the years?
I think we have, and in particular in COP17, we have some great milestone that goes towards the philosophy and our policy on conservation. Kenya is a leader in conservation across the world, and we offer leadership in the conservation of the African elephants, the African rhinos, and if we say list African elephants on Appendix 1, we have a basis because we have a strong science base, we have a good database, a collection from the time CITES came into force and Kenya signed in 1978. We have the history. For example, when in 1989, Kenya and the US and even Tanzania pushed for listing of African elephants on Appendix 1 of CITES, our population had been reduced from 167,000 to 16,000.
Wow. That is a massive reduction.
That was an over 80% reduction.
Yeah.
Our elephants actually were leading to extinction. So the listing on Appendix 1 so that population recover. So CITES works. We have now almost doubled up our population to the current population of over 30,000.
Wow.
So CITES works, and in certain instances, certain decisions sometimes are not based in science.
Right.
And you'll find people not happy about the outcome.
Yeah.
And in those instances, I think for Kenya, we've been calling for a precautionary approach that if trade has impact, we know there are other issues of climate change. We have habitat loss because of a high growth of human population, conflicting land uses. But for us in Kenya, where we know tourism drives our economy and wildlife products that contribute 70% to tourism industry.
Yeah.
So for us, we value these animals when they're alive.
As much as the importance is being put on the animals, of course, more importance needs to be put on the plant species as well. Beatrice, going to CITES from your department, what were the proposals that you took to CITES?
We had 3 documents for Kenya, but the most important one was the proposal on Dalmbaja, which we know as mpingo in Kenya, and that is what we use for carvings. It's a very valuable timber tree used in making musical instruments, furniture, and timber in general. So that was our main proposal, together with Brazil, Argentina, and Guatemala. The other documents were on sandalwood, which us in Eastern Africa have listed on Appendix 2. There are decisions to do with it, which list certain activities that we are supposed to undertake. And then Kenya also chairs an intersessional working group on African trees. And again, that had activities assigned that need to be implemented before COP18. So those are our 3 documents, but the most important one was the Dalmbaja, which we are happy to say went very well.
And one might argue that if this species does go into extinction, then what? Why does it matter so much? Why are these species so critical?
I think every species has a role to play in an ecosystem. There's also an economy pegged on these species. I mean, imagine the carving industry if this tree were to disappear. So the fact that they each has a role to play, I think it's important that we protect every single species, whether they are plants or animals.
Rhoda, from a legislation point of view, what did you and your team go to CITES in mind with? What did you hope to achieve over there?
2 main things, really. The first was that our branding as Kenya depends on the way our laws are interpreted or seen to be enforcing the provisions of CITES. And so we went with an agenda to show the secretariat that was charged with the responsibility of doing an appraisal that to the extent that the law requires to address certain issues, and the issues were basically that we designate a management authority and a scientific authority, that we have provisions that adequately take care of illegal trade, therefore making sure that we have adequate and concretized provisions on licensing of trade where it is permitted, issues around criminalization of the illegal provisions, and issues also around follow the proceeds of crime.
Right.
Yeah, those 4 issues are the issues that they think we have to satisfy for us to be considered as having complied.
Right.
Legislation.
But Rhoda, let me ask you, why aren't we there yet? Why has it taken so long for us to put these laws into place? I mean, like we've said, you know, Kenya has been participating in CITES for so many years now. Why only now?
That is not to say that we did not have the law in place. It was just felt that there were very many loopholes for crime to prosper in the previous law. And of course, as you appreciate, the legislative process in Kenya has to be followed. And as a matter of fact, I consider it a big win because in the region, and I think even the world, Kenya has the strongest wildlife conservation and management legislation currently. And so even as we sat with the Secretariat to take them through what we have on the table and to base our facts on how we have performed in the courts in relation to implementing the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act, we were able to show that actually we have already arrived. And what is pending is just conclusion of one particular aspect, which is basically the regulations that would better implement the Act.
So progress is being made. Solomon, tell us now about your team and your department headed when you headed to CITES, what was your agenda and what did you hope to achieve?
Diet-specific proposals that I was leading in, and these are proposals on snakes. I mentioned we had two species of snakes that we were seeking to be listed in Appendix 2. We have one, the Mount Kenya horned viper, and the Kenya horned viper. Then we had another species of chameleons.
Solomon, what are these snakes valued for?
These two specific species are sought for as pets. So the pet industry is a huge industry in Asia and Europe and the US. So these two specific species, which are endemic to Kenya, they are not found anywhere in the world. They are highly sought, the value is very high because they are very beautiful snakes.
And you know, you mentioned pangolins. I bet that so many of our viewers watching don't know what a pangolin is, what it looks like, that we have them in Kenya and where they can be found in Kenya. Perhaps we don't want to share where they can be found. But tell us a little bit more about the pangolin.
Pangolins are mammals, so they give birth to young ones. They have scales, and they are specialized diet. They eat termites, just like the anteaters, termites and the ants. The reason why they are endangered first is because the production rate is very low, and that's their nature. Yeah. But they are also highly sought for international trade, especially for the Oriental medicine, the Chinese medicine, especially the scales and the meat.
How many pangolins do we have here in Kenya?
The whole of Africa has four species, the whole of Africa. But out of those 4 species in Kenya, we have 3. Okay. So 3 species out of the 4 are found in Kenya.
Wow. All right. Amazing that, you know, pangolins are found in Kenya and they are extremely highly traded. Patrick, what proposals did you go forth with?
We went with the proposal to list the African elephants on Appendix 1 of CITES. And we had also 4 related documents on elephants. One is to close all the ivory domestic markets where they exist. And the other one was to stop the process of discussing on how future trades will be done, because we felt it was sending wrong signals to criminals that are currently very organized. So Kenya and 30 other African states wanted this discussion stopped, particularly in this COP.
Okay.
The other one was to come up with a process on how ivory stocks are managed and disposed, and then the trade in live animals that we feel should be only meant on moving from wild should only go to natural habitats, not to captive areas.
Okay, so lots and lots of proposals at CITES at the COP17 that took place in South Africa earlier this month. When we come back from the break, we will find out more about the outcomes of these proposals and what next after COP17. Do stay with us on NTV Wild Talk. Before we take a break, here is our wild guess question. What does CITES stand for? What does CITES stand for? To participate, just like the NTV Wild Facebook page, only answers posted on the timeline post that's associated with this question will be considered. The first person to answer correctly wins 1 night for 2 people at the Masada Hotel in Naivasha. That's part of the Superior Hotels group. It's a great and comfortable getaway from the city. The winner also gets 1 bottle of wine courtesy of Wines of the World and a gift hamper courtesy of Wildlife Direct. Terms and conditions apply. Last week's lucky winner was Damaris Waigwa. Welcome back to NTV Wild Talk. Here is a reminder of our wild guest question. What does CITES stand for? What does CITES stand for? To participate, just like the NTV Wild Facebook page, only answers posted on the timeline post that's associated with this question will be considered. The first person to answer correctly wins one night for 2 people at the Masada Hotel in Naivasha. That's part of the Superior Hotels group. It's a great and comfortable getaway from the city. The winner also gets 1 bottle of wine, courtesy of Wines of the World, and a gift hamper, courtesy of Wildlife Direct. Terms and conditions apply. Last week's lucky winner was Damaris Waigwa. So now my conversation about CITES and the outcomes of the COP17 continues. Beatrice, I'll start with you. What were some of the biggest successes and also the biggest letdowns for you and what you were focusing on?
For us plants, fortunately, there isn't a lot of conflict, but the biggest win for Kenya and its partners on the proposal on Dalmagia, which I refer to as Mpingo or Rosewood, was to have all the genus in Appendix 2. Now what that means is all the species, any export, import will be subject to regulation, but it will not impact on the local trade. That means there's a provision for the little traders to continue, and that is called an annotation or an exemption. And in this case for Kenya, we have a permissible amount of not more than 10 kilos for non-commercial use. So for that, the trade will continue for the local communities as long as they're within the regulated amount.
Right.
And then with the other documents, we were successful in getting our activities that we have not been able to implement to continue until the next COP18, as well as the African tree species. So all the plant species, most of them went through.
Solomon, are our snakes, our pangolins and chameleons on the safe list? Tell us about the outcomes from what you focused on.
It was a great success. We got all the pangolins, not only the African pangolins, but also the Asian pangolins. All the 8 species are now in Appendix 1.
Wow.
That was a great achievement. Then we had the chameleons. The only remaining genus of chameleon that had not been listed under CITES is now listed under CITES through consensus. Then we had the snakes, the 2 species of snakes. We tried in 2004 to have them listed. We were not successful, but this time we got them listed by consensus. By listing the 2 snakes in Appendix 2 and the chameleons in Appendix 2, it means trade will continue but regulated through the CITES permitting. By having the pangolins in Appendix 1, it means any trade is prohibited. It should not be touched.
Rhoda, what about you when it comes to legislation again?
We seized the opportunity really to revive talk and discussion around cybercrime, because illegal trade has now stopped having the physical form and now we have it online everywhere. And so for us, Kenya moved the motion to reignite debate on cybercrime so that we can have in place preventive as well as enforcement support in that regard. And the big win was that that particular proposal received what I would call 100%
Really?
acceptance. Basically everyone supported it that had the chance to speak. With regard to national legislation, I was happy that even though it wasn't on the floor of the House, but it was a matter that required a lot of focus on helping the Secretariat appreciate where we are at. We were able to have a discussion that placed Kenya in a clarified position as far as our laws are concerned. Right. And actually, right now, what is left is the little bit of finalization.
Patrick, some might argue that there was a big disappointment and a big letdown when it came to the elephants being listed on Appendix 1. Tell us a little bit more about that.
One of the biggest milestones is that the proposal that was to open up trade that was put up by Zimbabwe and Namibia was rejected through a voting system. And there is a ban that is in force on international trade in ivory. We also had a milestone with the proposal that we had put together with the other 29 African states, and together with the US to close legal ivory markets, including China supporting that move, and is one of the biggest market for ivory.
But what about the listing of the African elephant on Appendix 1 in some countries?
All 37 African elephants, except those of Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, are on Appendix 1 of CITES. There was a downlisting that was done in 1997, although Kenya and many parties opposed it, to allow them to do some experiment to sell ivory. And those experiments failed, and we have been linking them to the current crisis that elephant is facing across the globe. So the 29 African states plus one Asian state had put up the proposal to move all the 4 populations back to Appendix 1. One of the big surprises of the COP proposal was Botswana, because their population is on Appendix 2. But the government of Botswana supported the listing proposal. And I think the argument that the 30 African states have, that elephants have no political boundaries. I was disappointed with that. That one of the major voting bloc, which is the European Union, did not support it. And that's how the Appendix 1 listing of the 4 population did not pass. But it is not a very big disappointment to the agenda entirely. One, because we stopped discussion on how future trade can be done.
Meaning just it's not happening.
Stopped. We are not going to talk about trade. And again, we also ensured that any proposal that was proposing to open international trade was also not approved. In other words, international ban in trade in ivory is in place.
All right, brilliant. Really, implementing what came out of COP17 is what needs to start now. Solomon, what next for the area that you focus on?
For the case of the sandalwood, we have quite a number of activities that we need to do as a country. First, understanding the populations and coming up with measures to give stronger protection to the species and the regulation. With respect to the pangolins, which we now have in Appendix 1, that means no trade, we need to do a lot of work. We need to involve science and collect all sort of data, scientific data, and any trade data. And again, we also need to see how we need to manage the stockpiles that we have seized, because we have seized quite a number of quantities of scales. So there are a lot of actions that we need to do as a country. Then we have what we call the National Ivory Action Plan, that we push to have a process of how the action plans will be implemented. Certainly we require resources to implement that. We require resources to undertake research on the species that we have already listed and the others that are still endangered, and we may need to consider to prepare proposals for submission at the next one. So the work has just begun.
Definitely.
Begun the work,
All right, Beatrice, what about you?
By listing Dalbergia, the whole genus, in Appendix 2, that is a huge, huge, huge job. There has to be a lot of awareness raising. There has to be a lot of capacity building, so that everyone involved understands that now the species are under regulation. How do you get the permits? What am I allowed to take? So that is very, very, very important, and the country has to take a lead into that, because Kenya is the one that took a lead in supporting the proposal. Solomon has made reference to sandalwood. We need to do field assessment to know exactly what we have. And finally, we are taking a lead in the African tree species. This is an international role we are playing. Again, the people who are involved have to be supported by the country to provide that leadership and to prepare a report for the next COP.
Wow, okay. And Rhoda, of course, implementation, the law plays such a big role in the success of the outcomes of COP17.
The beauty of everything is that we are steps ahead as far as the law is concerned. Of course, there needs to be an understanding that even after we passed the Wildlife Management, the Conservation and Management Act, we identified the bottlenecks and we prepared amendments. They are at the level of being passed through the legislation process. We will need support both from the members of parliament and citizens by way of participation. Implementing of the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act requires regulations to operationalize certain provisions in the Act. Those regulations, fortunately, have already been drafted. And in fact, I think there's already been a notice to the effect that there should be a public participation forum to discuss them so that they can be promulgated. I think we need a lot of support in that regard. So, I mean, it's a happy moment for us, taking into account that we visualize this as the roadmap to getting us out of the bad naming in the Gang of Eight. But the other thing is cybercrime for me. We are miles ahead, I guess, because Kenya is already in the process of doing its cybercrime legislation. Okay. But as a leader of the motion, we would need a platform to share with the rest what the best practices are. And now this one requires support at the international level.
Okay,
so
what everybody has mentioned so far is support, resources. Do we have enough of that to implement everything?
These criminals are well organized, they're well resourced, they're international in nature, they're very smart, they have better gun power than even our law enforcement. They have used satellite phones, they can see at night, so a lot of resources is required. So will require support in terms of law enforcement.
Yeah.
We want to beef up our surveillance at the port, our dog unit, our partners, the customs and everybody, so that all these guys are arrested and they face the full force of the law.
Right.
So that Kenya is not branded like, we are a weak spot at our ports and the things just pass.
Target,
so we
right.
need to arrest these people. We need to work with our communities because they are the front line in fighting this crime.
Certainly, yes.
There was a lot of discussion at the COP about communities' role on CITES itself.
So really a lot of work still needs to be done, but just very briefly from each of you, on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the best, how would you rate COP17?
on my part, I would say at 4 actually.
Okay,
Yes.
and yourself, Solomon?
Having participated in quite a number of COPs for the last 16 years, I'll give it 4.8.
Okay. What about you?
In terms of coordination, preparedness for Kenya,
Yeah.
I'll give it 4.9.
Okay, all right.
For me, I'll give it 5 for Kenya. Yes.
Patrick, thanks very much. Beatrice, thank you for your time, and also Rhoda and Solomon. You're watching NTV Wild Talk. We're shifting focus now. Here are your photos that you sent in on our Wild Pick that demonstrate your love for nature and the environment. This is Anthony Ochieng on Mount Longonot. He was posing at the crater, and Anthony said he had hiked up with a youth group and says Mount Longonot is his favourite place. Now on Mount Kenya, this is Ngugi Alex Mwangi. He had gone there for a hike, and he says that he's an ardent fan of mountain climbing. He's climbed Mount Longonot, the Ngong Hills, and also Mount Kenya. This is Jacqueline Newton. She's at the Giraffe Centre and she's feeding the giraffes, perhaps giving the giraffe a quick kiss too. Jacqueline says that she loves the wild and enjoys being around giraffes. At Kanzalu Hill in Machakos County, this is a snap of Samuel Gital. Samuel is a tour guide and had taken a group of clients for a scenic tour. Samuel says that he likes discovering new tourist gems. Kelvin Mudiani was at Kio in Kitui County. He was sitting on a dry log, and Kelvin says that he took a nature drive to a deserted area to explore the beauty of the vast dry land. This area borders Garissa and Tana River. If you want your photos showcased on our Wild Pick segment, just like our NTV Wild Facebook page and send a photo that shows you celebrating nature via private message. Include your full name, tell us where the photo was taken, what you were doing and why. And now here's what's coming up on the NTV Wild documentary series on Saturday night.
The cubs in the marsh pride of lions may look endearing, but as they get older, they also start pushing their weight around. But how tolerant can a mother lion be? Shadow the leopard is on a roll when it comes to hunting. But this time, a bold jackal threatens to spoil her next kill. And we look at the anatomy of a cheetah hunt, both from the cat's point of view and from ours.
So according to the Kenyan delegation, the CITES COP17 was a success. But of course, as you heard, more support is required and resources too in order to implement the outcomes of the Conference of the Parties. And that support can come from you too. That's where we leave it on NTV Wild Talk with me, Smriti Vidyarthi. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you again next Tuesday, 10 p.m.
I usually laugh.
Okay, fine. So do I just Google this? You brought us to a place where we're going to melt.
Yes, that's the point.
problem.
Did you not consider that? Oh, that's far. Today we're coming to you from the safari walk at the Kenya Wildlife Headquarters here in Nairobi. No.
NTV Wild Talk in partnership with the Kenya Wildlife Service and Wildlife Direct.